Jonas Ryder stared at the fragile glass chalice in his hands, acutely aware that a single slip could destroy both the priceless artifact and humanity's best hope for an alliance. The chalice was absurdly tiny, barely large enough to hold a teaspoon of the steaming, indigo liquid it contained. Across the low ceremonial table, Captain Liora Vena observed him with a smirk, her silver-blue skin shimmering under the light of Ziathra's twin suns. Her golden eyes sparkled mischievously as she demonstrated the proper handling technique, her petite hands moving with elegant precision. "Perhaps we should have prepared a child's practice set for our Earth representative," she quipped, eliciting chuckles from the other council members. "Though I suspect even that would prove too challenging." Jonas kept his expression calm, though his jaw tightened ever so slightly. 15 years in the Space Corps had hardened him against insults. He'd faced rebels, pirates, and disaster across countless worlds. He wasn't about to let a diminutive, sharp-tongued alien, no matter how breathtaking she was, ruffle his composure. "Your concern is touching, Captain," he replied smoothly, imitating her motions with painstaking care. "But I assure you, humans can be surprisingly delicate when circumstances demand it." Leora's eyebrow arched. "Is that so? Yet you lumber through our sacred halls like a drunken Theris beast, ducking under doorways meant for beings of refinement." Jonas suppressed a grin as the council members, none taller than his waist, muttered their agreement. He lifted the chalice to his lips and took a measured sip. The liquid burned like fire, but he maintained his composure. Before anyone could speak, Elder Caliph, the aged council leader, rapped his staff on the floor, commanding silence. "We are gathered to discuss the terms of unity," he began, his voice thin but steady. Jonas noticed Leora's posture stiffen at the words. They both knew what was coming. The marriage arrangement, negotiated in secret, was about to be made public. "The human delegation has proposed a union of our peoples," Caliph continued, "through the sacred bond of marriage between Captain Vena and Commander Ryder." The room erupted into chaos. Leora shot to her feet, her ceremonial armor gleaming in the sunlight. "I would sooner marry a boulder," she exclaimed, motioning toward Jonas. "At least it would be silent and immovable." Jonas stood, his imposing frame towering over the assembly. "The boulder accepts your metaphor, Captain," he replied dryly, "though I should warn you. We can be surprisingly mobile when shaken." Their gazes locked, the charged silence crackling like an energy field. Jonas couldn't help but notice the way anger deepened the purple tones in Leora's cheeks and the fierce set of her full lips. Caliph's staff struck the floor again, silencing the room. "The decision is final. For the survival of our worlds, this union must proceed." "Elder," Leora protested, her voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "How can we entrust our sacred ways to these towering brutes? He cannot even manage a simple tea ceremony without risking destruction." Jonas set his chalice down with exaggerated care. "If you're so concerned about my lack of grace, Captain," he said evenly, "perhaps you'd care to demonstrate your superiority in the training arena." Her eyes lit with a predatory gleam. "I thought you'd never ask, Earthling," she replied, then turned to the elder. "With your permission, of course." Caliph stroked his silver beard. "Granted. But remember, this is only a demonstration. Both of you must remain intact for the bonding ceremony." As they exited the chamber, Jonas ducked under yet another low doorway. Behind him, Leora's melodic laugh echoed. "Mind your head, Commander," she teased. "Perhaps a few knocks might improve your judgment." "Your concern is touching, as always," he replied. "Though I notice you spent a lot of time looking up." She smirked. Someone has to make sure you don't bring the ceiling down. The training arena was a wide, open-air courtyard surrounded by crystalline spires that refracted the sunlight into a kaleidoscope of colors. The ground was covered in a springy, foam-like material. Liora shed her ceremonial armor, revealing a sleek training suit that clung to her lithe form. Jonas forced himself to keep his gaze on her face, though her knowing smile suggested she'd noticed his hesitation. Our combat relies on speed, precision, and adaptability, she explained, her voice smug. Qualities I imagine are foreign to your kind. Jonas shrugged off his diplomatic jacket, revealing the form-fitting undershirt of Earth's military. You might be surprised. The crowd of onlookers grew as Liora flowed into a series of acrobatic stretches. Jonas watched, impressed despite himself. Her movements combined grace with deadly efficiency. The challenge is simple, Liora announced, adopting a ready stance. Land a touch on your opponent while avoiding being touched yourself. First to 3 wins. Shall we grant you a handicap? Jonas rolled his shoulders, settling into position. Feel free to handicap yourself however you see fit. Annoyance flickered across her features. Without warning, she lunged, a silver-blue blur of motion. Jonas sidestepped, her momentum carrying her past him. Her golden eyes widened. Not bad, she admitted, circling him. But dodging isn't scoring. Just warming up, he replied. The next exchange was faster, her movements a blur of feints and spins. But Jonas anticipated her trajectory, brushing her shoulder. Point, he said simply. Her cheeks flushed violet, and the match escalated. She scored 2 rapid points, her strikes swift and relentless. But Jonas had noticed something, a subtle tell in her footwork. When she leaped for the final strike, he moved to intercept. Her foot slipped. Without thinking, he caught her, steadying her against his chest. They froze, her breath warm against his neck, her hands clutching his arms. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the 2 of them. Then she pulled away, smoothing her suit. Call it a draw, she muttered. Of course, Jonas agreed, fighting a smile. Wouldn't want to risk another accident. She shot him a warning glance, but didn't argue. Tomorrow, the bonding ceremony preparations begin. Don't be late. As she walked away, Jonas watched her go, a smile tugging at his lips. This union might not be the diplomatic disaster he'd feared, though something told him the coming days would be unforgettable. The sacred halls of Velarath Temple buzzed with activity. Jonas Ryder stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching the whirlwind of preparations for the bonding ceremony. Velvet banners embroidered with swirling, silver patterns hung from the crystalline walls. Priests in attendance, all half his height, hurried back and forth, carrying glowing artifacts and baskets of strange, fragrant petals. The entire event felt more like a military operation than a wedding. And at the center of it all was Captain Liora Vena, her commanding voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. No, the resonance crystals must be arranged counterclockwise, she snapped at a fumbling attendant. Do you want to throw the entire shielding array out of sync? And where is the human ceremonial attire? Jonas stepped forward, clearing his throat. The human has a name, you know, he said with a smirk. Liora turned, her golden eyes narrowing as she took him in. He was dressed in the standard black uniform he'd arrived in, starkly out of place amidst the shimmering elegance of her people. Of course you're early, she muttered, crossing her arms. Do Earthlings have no concept of punctuality? He grinned. On the contrary, I just thought I'd give you more time to critique my every move. Wouldn't want you to run out of material before the ceremony. Her lips twitched, almost forming a smile, but she masked it quickly. There's still time to reconsider this arrangement, Commander. Perhaps you'd prefer to marry one of our ancient monuments instead? I hear they're more your speed, silent, unyielding, and far less trouble. Jonas leaned closer, lowering his voice. I think you'd miss me. Her cheeks flushed that deep violet again, But before she could retort, a booming voice interrupted. "Commander Rider." Jonas turned to see Elder Caliph approaching, his staff clinking against the polished floor. The elderly council leader looked even smaller next to Jonas, but his presence commanded respect. "We require your assistance with a delicate matter," Caliph said, glancing between him and Liora. "The bonding ritual requires both participants to retrieve the Shard of Unity from the Abyss Cavern. It is a sacred tradition, symbolizing cooperation and mutual trust." "Abyss Cavern?" Jonas asked, raising an eyebrow. "Sounds inviting." "It is a treacherous place," Caliph admitted. "The path is narrow, and the terrain is unstable. That is why it must be completed together. Alone, you would fail. Together." He left the sentence hanging. Jonas turned to Liora, whose jaw tightened at the elder's words. "You've done this before?" he asked. "Of course," she said stiffly. "It's a rite of passage for our people. But never," she hesitated, glancing up at him. "Never with someone of your size." "Good thing I'm adaptable," Jonas replied, flashing her a grin. "Shall we?" The entrance to the cavern yawned open like the mouth of some ancient beast. Cool, damp air seeped from the darkness, carrying with it the faint hum of resonating crystals. Jonas ducked through the low opening, his broad shoulders brushing the jagged walls. Liora slipped in behind him, her movements fluid and confident. "Stay close," she said, pulling a slender, glowing rod from her belt. The light cast flickering shadows along the walls, revealing the treacherous path ahead. "Close enough to catch you again if you slip," he teased, earning a glare. "Just don't fall and crush me, human," she shot back. The path wound downward, narrowing as they descended. The ground beneath Jonas' boots was slick, the crystalline surface glinting faintly in the dim light. Liora moved ahead, her smaller frame better suited to the tight quarters. "Careful," she warned, pointing to a gap in the path where a sharp drop-off revealed a glowing, green abyss. "One wrong step, and you'll be tumbling into a very long fall." "Noted," Jonas replied, carefully maneuvering around the gap. As they continued, the hum of the crystals grew louder, vibrating through the air. It was oddly soothing, like a distant melody. "What exactly is this Shard of Unity?" Jonas asked, breaking the silence. "It's an ancient relic," Liora explained, her tone more serious than usual. "It was formed from the fusion of two opposing energy cores during our planet's earliest wars. It symbolizes harmony and balance." Jonas raised an eyebrow. "Sounds poetic. But why put in a death trap?" "It's a test," she said simply, "of strength, of trust. It's meant to ensure that the bond is forged through challenge, not convenience." He glanced at her, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "And what happens if we fail?" She hesitated. "Failure isn't an option." They reached a particularly narrow stretch of the path, where the walls pressed close on either side. Jonas frowned, realizing he wouldn't fit without turning sideways. "You're joking," he muttered. "Not at all," Liora said, clearly amused. "This is where most would-be pairs stumble. Try not to get stuck, Commander." Jonas sighed, shifting to squeeze through the gap. His boots scraped against the floor, and his shoulders wedged uncomfortably between the walls. Liora waited on the other side, arms crossed, clearly enjoying his struggle. "I swear if you laugh," Jonas grunted, inching forward. "Laugh? I wouldn't dream of it," she said, her voice laced with mock innocence. Finally, he emerged on the other side, breathing hard. Liora's smirk was infuriatingly smug. "Not bad for a mountain," she said. Jonas opened his mouth to reply, but a sudden rumble cut him off. The ground beneath them trembled, loose stones clattering to the floor. "Was that?" Jonas began, but Leora's sharp gesture silenced him. "Move. Now," she ordered, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. The tremors grew stronger as they hurried along the path, the glow of the crystals intensifying. Jonas could feel the vibrations through his boots, the cavern groaning as if alive. "There!" Liora pointed to a pedestal at the center of an open chamber ahead. Atop it rested the Shard of Unity, a jagged, crystalline fragment pulsing with light. As they approached, the ground beneath them shifted violently, a fissure splitting the path. Jonas grabbed Liora instinctively, lifting her over the gap as the floor crumbled behind them. "Not bad, Earthling," she said breathlessly as they reached the pedestal. "I'm full of surprises," he replied. Together, they reached for the shard, their hands brushing as they lifted it from its resting place. The hum of the cavern quieted, the tremors subsiding. For a moment, the air felt still, charged with a strange energy. Liora glanced up at him, her golden eyes unreadable. "Perhaps you're not entirely hopeless." Jonas chuckled. "High praise coming from you." As they began their ascent back to the surface, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had shifted. And so, the first crack in the icy wall between them had formed. By the time they emerged from the abyss cavern, the twin suns of Velarath were dipping below the horizon, casting the crystalline spires of the temple in hues of gold and violet. The shard of unity pulsed faintly in Leora's hands, its light reflecting off her smooth indigo skin. Beside her, Jonas stretched, his tall frame silhouetted against the vibrant sky. "Well," Jonas said, brushing dust off his uniform, "if this was supposed to be a bonding experience, I give it a solid 7 out of 10. Room for improvement on the hospitality." Liora shot him a sidelong glance. "Your ability to reduce a sacred ritual to a casual earth joke is unsurprising." "I like to keep things light," Jonas replied with a smirk. "Besides, you didn't seem too annoyed when I saved your life back there." "Saved my life?" Leora's brow furrowed, and she turned to face him fully. "You lifted me over a crack in the floor. Hardly heroic." Jonas chuckled. "Admit it, Captain. If it weren't for me, you'd still be stuck down there glaring at that fissure." "Perhaps," she said, her voice unusually soft. "Or perhaps you would have fallen without my guidance." Jonas blinked, caught off guard. For the first time, there was no bite in her tone, no teasing jab. Instead, her golden eyes held his, steady and unguarded. For a moment, the tension between them shifted, no longer crackling like static, but softening, almost like. Liora cleared her throat and turned away, her usual briskness returning. "We should return to the temple. The shard must be prepared for tomorrow's ceremony." Jonas followed her, falling in a step beside her. "So," he began after a moment of silence, "what happens during this bonding ceremony, anyway? I assume it's not just a handshake and a glass of champagne." She glanced at him, clearly weighing how much to tell him. "The bonding ceremony is symbolic," she said at last. "It involves a public oath, the exchange of gifts, and the merging of energies through the shard of unity. The ritual creates a metaphysical connection between us, binding our fates." Jonas raised an eyebrow. "Binding our fates? That sounds intense." "It is," she replied, her tone grave. "The bond is not easily broken. It's why our people take this tradition so seriously." Jonas nodded, his usual humor giving way to quiet thought. The weight of what was being asked of them settled over him. This wasn't just an alliance or a political gesture. It was a commitment on a level he hadn't fully grasped before. "You're nervous," Liora observed, breaking his reverie. He snorted. "Me? Nervous? Nah. I just spent the day in a collapsing cavern with a feisty alien warrior. Tomorrow's ceremony can't possibly be more stressful than that." Her lips twitched, and for a second, he thought she might actually smile. Jonas was settling into the guest quarters, a room clearly designed for someone Leora's size, when a soft chime at the door startled him. Ducking under the low doorway, he opened it to find Liora standing there, her posture stiff and her expression unreadable. "Captain," he said surprised, "to what do I owe the honor?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around a small, wrapped object in her hands. "It is customary," she began, her voice formal, "for bonded pairs to exchange preliminary gifts before the ceremony, to signify goodwill." Jonas leaned against the doorframe, his curiosity piqued. "And you brought me a gift." Liora thrust the object toward him, clearly uncomfortable. "Take it before I reconsider." He accepted it, unwrapping the cloth to reveal a smooth, metallic bracelet etched with intricate patterns. The symbol seemed to shimmer faintly, catching the light. "It's beautiful," he said sincerely. "It's a bonding cuff," Liora explained, her voice still stiff. "It represents protection and partnership. The symbols tell a story." Jonas traced the etchings with his fingers, noticing the care that had gone into the design. What story? She hesitated again, her cheeks flushing that familiar violet. It's personal. He looked up, meeting her gaze. Thank you, Liora. Really? Her eyes widened slightly at the use of her first name, but she didn't correct him. Instead, she nodded curtly and turned to leave. Wait, Jonas said, stepping forward. I don't have anything for you. I didn't know about the gift exchange. She paused, glancing back at him. It's not required, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. Jonas thought quickly, then reached up and unclasped the dog tags hanging around his neck. He held them out to her. These aren't much, he said, but they mean a lot to me. They've been with me through everything, every mission, every close call. I guess you could say they're a reminder to keep going, no matter what. Liora stared at the tags for a long moment before taking them, her fingers brushing his. I'll take care of them, she said quietly. As she walked away, Jonas leaned against the doorframe, watching her retreating form. The tiny bracelet on his wrist felt heavier than it should, and he couldn't help but wonder what exactly he was getting himself into. That night, sleep didn't come easily for either of them. Liora lay in her quarters, turning Jonas' dog tags over in her hands. The simple, unadorned metal was a stark contrast to the ornate artifact she was used to, yet it felt significant in a way she couldn't explain. Jonas, meanwhile, stared at the ceiling of his too-small room, the bracelet catching the moonlight as he twisted it around his wrist. He thought of the way Liora had looked at him in the cavern, her sharp edges softening for just a moment. Neither of them could deny it anymore. Something had shifted. And tomorrow, when they stood before the council and their people, they would have to face it head-on. The grand ceremonial hall of Velarath shimmered with golden light. Crystals embedded in the walls refracted the glow of the twin suns, casting kaleidoscopic patterns on the gathered crowd. Jonas stood at the far end of the chamber, his broad frame contrasting with the delicate architecture around him. Beside him, Liora adjusted the ceremonial cuff on her wrist, her expression carefully neutral. The air was thick with expectation. This was it, the moment where duty, tradition, and survival all collided. Elder Vero stepped forward, his silver staff striking the polished floor with a resonant chime. Today, he intoned, his voice carrying across the hall, we witness the union of two worlds. A bond forged not through conquest, but through trust, through partnership. Jonas resisted the urge to glance at Liora, focusing instead on the elder's words. His palms were damp, though he'd never admit it. The shard of unity, Vero continued, gesturing to the glowing crystal suspended above them, will seal this bond. Captain Liora of Velarath, Commander Jonas of Earth, step forward. Liora moved first, her movements precise and controlled, as if she were walking into battle. Jonas followed, his steps measured but heavy, the sound echoing in the chamber. They stood before the shard, its light pulsing softly, almost as if it were alive. Vero handed each of them a smaller crystal, carved from the shard itself. You must speak your vows, the elder said, the words that bind your fates. Liora turned to Jonas, her golden eyes locking onto his. For a moment, the tension in the room seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them. I vow, she began, her voice steady, to protect our people, to uphold the traditions of Velarath, and to honor this bond. I vow to fight alongside you, even when you stumble, to teach you, even when you resist, and to trust you, even when it feels impossible. Jonas blinked, caught off guard by the raw honesty in her tone. I vow, he said after a pause, his deep voice resonating, to stand with you, no matter the odds, to respect your traditions, even when I don't understand them, and to trust you, not because I have to, but because I want to, because I believe in you. Leora's eyes widened slightly at his words, but she said nothing. Vero raised his staff, signaling the next step. Place your crystals in the shard, he instructed. Together, they reached out, their hands brushing as they pressed their crystals into the glowing mass. The shard flared brightly, and for a brief moment, everything else disappeared. Jonas felt a strange warmth wash over him, not just in his body, but in his mind. It was as if a thread had been woven between him and Liora, connecting them in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. He glanced at her and saw the same astonishment reflected in her eyes. The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound echoing through the chamber. Jonas and Liora turned to face the assembly, their expressions unreadable. The celebrations had ended, the hall now quiet save for the faint hum of the shard. Jonas stood on a balcony overlooking the crystalline city, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the warmth of the ceremony. Jonas. He turned to see Liora standing in the doorway, her ceremonial armor replaced with a simpler tunic. Her usual sharpness was absent, replaced by something softer. "Captain," he greeted, a teasing smile tugging at his lips. She stepped closer, her golden eyes searching his face. "I meant what I said today," she said quietly. "About trusting you. It wasn't easy to admit, but I do." Jonas leaned against the railing, his expression serious now. "It wasn't easy for me either. I've spent my whole life following orders, but this," he gestured between them, "this feels different, like it actually matters." Liora nodded, the faintest smile touching her lips. "It does." They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them no longer sharp but warm, like the glow of the shard. Finally, Jonas spoke. "So, does this mean you'll stop calling me a clumsy giant?" She smirked, her usual spark returning. "Not a chance. You'll always be a giant, Jonas. But maybe not so clumsy." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll take it." As the twin moons rose over Velarath, casting their light across the city, the two of them stood side by side, the weight of their bond settling over them, not as a burden, but as something new and unshakable. And for the first time, they both felt ready to face whatever came next. Together.